We're fortunate today. We have one at Dartmouth's own, and it's a real pleasure to have a faculty member that's right in our midst speak to us. We have Dr. Richard Granger. Professor Granger is in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth. He's an expert in brain modeling. He's published more than 100 papers in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Granger runs the Brain Engineering Laboratory, which is a very interesting multidisciplinary initiative that's bringing together mathematicians, engineers, and computer scientists to try to model the brain. Some of his recent titles are very intriguing. For example, talking about the hypergeometric connectivity hypothesis, as well as models of the thalamocortical system. So he's a real expert in this area. I was privileged to see him talk not too long ago, and some of you might have been at the Polytrauma Brain Symposium. I don't know if it was brain, I guess it was just the Polytrauma Symposium that was here in August that Joe Rosen did, and happened to catch Dr. Granger's talk, so we're in for a real treat today to have him speak. So, Rich, if you're ready, we'll let you have it.
Okay, so increasingly the analytical tools that we have are enabling us to drill down and pull apart, analyze brain circuits in a way that has simply not been possible until very recent years. This is to remind me to say that pretty much all the work that I'm going to be describing today was done by someone other than me, and this is a list, partial list really, of collaborators, current collaborators, including a bunch of graduate and undergraduate students, faculty members here and elsewhere. Most of what I'm going to be doing is describing to you brain circuit computation. That is, we're going to look at brain circuits, I'm going to derive some algorithms, we're going to analyze those algorithms, and we're going to apply them and see how it is that brain circuits are doing the kinds of things that they do. Your brain circuits right now are engaged in a combination of visual and auditory perception. You're looking at me, you're listening to a rapid-fire stream of auditory input. You're effortlessly integrating it with a bunch of memories that you already have stored. You might be storing new information in there. All of those abilities to recognize these things, to listen to this speech, to recognize my face, to track it as I move back and forth, all of those abilities, which are like baby abilities that anyone can do, some people's dogs can do them, they're all outside the reach of engineering. You can't build engineering boxes that recognize faces with anything like the accuracy or reliability that a human can do it. We can't build boxes that recognize, say, speech. So the primary motivator for the talk is that brains do things that we cannot build arbitrary engineering methods for. And it isn't for lack of smart people trying, and it isn't for lack of money. Billions and billions have been spent between industry and the military on tasks of this kind. An example that always brings it home is that of we were talking about it earlier today, that of the simple phone operator. That is, you call up, you dial 0, and it says city and state. You say Hanover, New Hampshire, and then it says, what listing please? And you say something, Lou's Restaurant. And it pauses, and then it says, please wait for a human operator. That task that it's trying to do of simply listening to that brief speech stream, Lou's Restaurant, especially when uttered by someone like me with absolutely no discernible accent. Right? And all it has to do is match it against an existing database of the entries in the Hanover phone book. Right? The Hanover phone book. Right? Tiny little thing. 50% of the time, it'll bop over to a human operator, and it'll fail to do that match. Try it yourself. You can try this experiment yourself at home. It's remarkable how hard it apparently is to do that apparently simple task, let alone, and that's a very constrained task, just a very brief little speech stream, let alone the unconstrained task of just listening to whatever it is that I'm going to say and somehow effortlessly, pretty effortlessly understanding it. The circuits that carry out those tasks apparently are doing something that we can think of as non-standard engineering. They're just circuits, they're not mystical, and we are going to spend the next hour demystifying them as much as possible. They do have some really, really interesting characteristics, in fact, some downright handy characteristics. One, they're intrinsically parallel. So all the algorithms that they carry out are being carried out in parallel. One of the reasons we know this is that individual brain cells are unbelievably, unimaginably, embarrassingly slow. So they operate on the millisecond time scale. And no self-respecting engineer would build a computer that operates on the millisecond time scale. And yet our brains, again, are outperforming most of those things that you can build. They scale so that the brains of mammals, for instance, which we're going to focus on, are incredibly similar. So the brain of a rat is incredibly similar to your brain. And mine, not just your brain, sorry. Our brains. Our brains are very similar to those of rat brains, and in fact, trained anatomists can have enormous trouble being able to tell the difference if you just simply give them a slide of rat brain tissue and human brain tissue. They're amazingly alike, and yet they scale from the size of a mouse to the size of a mammoth. A good 5 orders of magnitude, and as they're scaling, a point we're going to bring up in detail later, as they're scaling, even though they simply get bigger and they stay enormously similar to each other, clearly dogs can do things that rats can't, monkeys can do things that dogs can't, many humans can do things that most monkeys can't. You acquire new abilities as this thing scales up. That's a constraint. It's a computational constraint. How do you build something where you just make more of it and somehow you get new abilities out? Most of the abilities that it has are based on learning. So it acquires new information. It comes built in with quite a bit of stuff. When you're a baby, you do indeed have species-specific behaviors, whether you think so or like the idea or not. You do, and then you acquire everything else. And somehow that learning process is something that we want to capture. Furthermore, I'm using a phrase here, end-to-end integration, by which I mean you can go all the way from seeing something to acting on something. I can see that bottle, I can reach over, I can pick it up, I can see where I just moved it to, I can put it back, and all of that seamlessly. Turns out, engineering, not so much. When you try and build things like that, they really don't do what you design them to do. Anybody who's had experience building such things is cringing right now because they know it's true. So the status of what I'm going to describe to you is a series of algorithms that are derived from brain circuits, an architecture that those individual circuits fit into, big systems, analyses of these that scale, that can be implemented in silicon, I'll show you examples, and that can be fielded in sensor and robot implementations. And as we go through, I'm going to try to extract a set of principles that are underlying the methods that we're using, and we'll sort of build up a set of what we can call take-home messages that infuse the topic. The outline will be like this. Oh, I have this. Here we go. Dartmouth Green. I'm going to first talk about these brain circuits. I'm going to talk about how we derive algorithms from those, how those algorithms fit into architectures. So first the circuits, then algorithms, architectures, and learning, how we build circuits and then systems, and then finally how we implement these and apply them down to applications, implementations, and in particular a bunch of robot examples. So let's start with circuits. Mammals. You are a mammal, and mammals were invented about 200 million years ago. They diverged from the reptiles. They kept the reptilian brain, but they added this stuff on top called neocortex, which grows almost without bound, so much so that your brain, human brains, it's hard to see all the old reptilian stuff buried underneath the neocortical surface. So as brains grow, this is a graph just of primates, just of prosimians, monkeys, and apes, and you can see that human brains not only grow large, but they grow larger than you would expect for our body size. So human brains are off the chart, and yet the things that are inside, the stuff that the brain is made of, all the components from these names for things, neocortex, diencephalon, midbrain, you can see that for all these apes and monkeys, all the components of the brain are right where you would expect them to be allometrically. If you just took a particular brain, scaled it up a little bigger, every little part scales according to the overall scaling of the brain, including human brains. Which says, apparently, there's nothing special about you and me, nothing special about us. We just have the brains of big monkeys, and they're just scaled up exactly as you would expect. That's not what we like to hear. We like to think that there are specialized mechanisms in us. Where does language come from, of all things? Where do our special reasoning abilities come from? All the stuff that we do uniquely somehow, apparently, is emerging from components, brain components, that are simply exactly the same place, connectivity, and size that you would expect from any other primate brain just scaled up. So one of the computational questions we can ask is, how can you just change the size of something, add more of the same component to it, and get new abilities? It gets worse. So I know you thought this wasn't possible. As the brain scales, the proportion of it that is dedicated to recognizable, nameable tasks shrinks. So here's a rat, here's a monkey, this is a spider monkey. And what you can see in the rat is that he's got a big touch area, a big vision area, a big auditory area, a big smell, olfactory area, and a little bit of thinking area. Monkey, tiny touch, tiny vision, tiny auditory area, a lot of thinking space, and us, almost all big dark continent of unnameable areas that, well, we have names for them all, but they're not specialized. They're not different kind of material, and in particular, they are not different kinds of circuitry. All those surface cortical areas are attached to that reptilian brain that I described, to this middle sort of gaudy colored stuff in the middle. The striatum, the hippocampus, the thalamus, the amygdala are all tightly hooked in loops to the cortex, and we can build arbitrarily complex models. This is really just almost a scare slide just to suggest the kinds of models that many people, our lab and many other labs, are building. We can simplify this thing and say, okay, we've got cortex, we've got these underlying reptilian things, and there's a bunch of loops. There's a loop here, there's a loop here, and those loops, those large system structures, recur over and over again through your brain. So there's a loop, a set of loops of this kind that's dedicated to vision. There's one that's dedicated to hearing. There's one that's dedicated to touch. There's one that's dedicated to olfaction. There's even ones that are much more abstract, that are dedicated to tasks that we literally can't even wholly specify and name yet. This brain architecture is the architecture that we want to understand. It constitutes far more than 95% of your brain. We're going to back off from that huge thing and simplify it a little bit, and we're going to actually focus just on this particular loop between cortex and this thing called thalamus, which is where a lot of sensory processing, a lot of motor processing goes on. And because cortex is the thing that grows enormously with mammals, as I said, we're going to focus on these loops, and we're also going to pay a little bit of lip service to how these things fit into larger loops. So the first circuits that we're going to talk about are so-called thalamocortical loops. So there's a little piece of thing called thalamus here. All the rest of this is cortex, and they cycle in these loops. This is just little connectivity maps of these things. And our final, for the moment, engineering conundrum is the components that these circuits and loops are made out of. They're made from cells and synapses, cells and connections, synapses, and they've got a bunch of biochemistry that helps them, that enables them to run. They send, by and large, they send all their real signals via electrical impulses, and they're terrible at this. Their job is to send messages, and they're terrible at it. They are probabilistic, slow, milliseconds as I mentioned, sparse, very, very sparsely connected, and they're very low precision. They can't carry much information, and they're doing all the job. That's all you got. How's that working out for you? Somehow it is working out. You're listening, you're understanding, you're watching. It's all fine, but it's being done, it's being carried out with little machines, little components that, again, no self-respecting engineer would ever use to build a machine out of. So that was circuits. Let's take those circuits and dive down into them and look at what kinds of algorithms we can derive. So here are those two circuits that I talked about. Actually, in this slide, what I'm showing is the same circuit here, and all I've done is highlight them with this pink and purple color. I've highlighted parts. This left-hand part of the circuit, and here's the same circuit, but now I've highlighted this right-hand part, just because I'm going to tease them apart for the moment to analyze them separately, and then I'm going to put them back together and try and look at their coherent behavior. So we'll start with this guy, so-called core loop. Here he is. And here's what happens. Inputs come in right up here, and they follow these arrows. They go up to here, they cycle around here for a while, they go down here, and they feed back out. There are two kinds of cells. There's a bunch of kinds of cells, but there are two kinds for our purposes today. Excitatory cells that activate other cells, and inhibitory cells that turn off other cells. So the red guys are inhibitory, the green guys are excitatory. And now we're going to pace through this little cartoon very briefly. The cartoon is intended to capture the major ideas of a lot of work that's been done, again, in our lab and many other labs. I'm borrowing liberally from other people's work. I will give attribution when I think of it and when I want to. And the work that I'm going to describe is pretty readily capturable in these simple cartoons. So here's a way to think about the core loop. You're looking at a picture. You're just looking at it, and you're staring at it. So I'm going to put a picture up. There it is, a flower. It's a static image. And all you're going to do is look at it. So that flower, wires are going to come in from your eye, through your thalamus, and they're going to be carrying little feature information of the activity that's hitting your retina as you're looking at that picture. You're looking at a flower. You're looking at a face. Okay? Comes in, and input goes up here. And what this little circuit does is easy to intuit. Again, it's been carefully modeled in many people's hands, many laboratories' hands. What it does is it's got two parts to it. One, first, when these cells are activated, they in turn activate inhibitory cells, which in turn turn off the cells that just activated them. So there's a group of cells here, they activate a group of cells here, and they all get turned off. Negative feedback is a natural phenomenon that we all know and love. And what it sort of says is that somebody will come in, and some of these cells, if they're activated enough, will respond. And whoever responds, they'll activate these guys, and everybody will be turned off. So even though I might be staring at this picture, there'll be a brief response here, and then it'll be shut down. So it's actually engaged in a little competition. You could think of them as competitive cells. And all they're trying to do is respond the best they can. They're trying to find sort of the best responders get recruited. They respond, and then everybody gets shut down. Meanwhile, these inputs that are coming into these cells are connected via little connecting synapses, which we often label as W, and we think of them as weights, because they're pushing on the cell. They're determining how much input the cell gets from this input. Every time you see a picture, you have the capability of training those weights, that is, strengthening, making them weightier, and thereby making it easier for the same input to activate that cell the next time. So you see a flower, you train those weights. Next time you see a flower, the same cells will respond even more readily, more quickly. There's a side effect, which is that as you strengthen those connections, if some of the connections then are missing, so you see a slightly different flower, or you see a flower that where there's a bee buzzing around, or you see a flower where part of it is obscured, nonetheless, the remaining inputs will have been strengthened, and they'll therefore be enough to activate the same cells. That's learning. The effect of learning, according to that little description, the effect of learning is to enable this cell to respond even when it has slightly different, slightly variable inputs. So here's another way to say that. The effect of learning is to prevent you from making fine-grained discriminations. That's not good. Not what you expect. The effect of learning is to prevent you from making fine-grained discriminations. That statement is correct. It's true. And it's actually very useful because you don't want to have to see every possible configuration of that flower or every possible view of my face in order to remember it. You don't want to have to say, oh, wait, there's a new face. Oh, wait, there's another one. Oh, there's another one. No, what you do is you generalize, and that's what this mechanism is doing. It's generalizing. It's saying, I'm just going to respond face. I'm just going to say, that's a face. That's a flower. Good enough. So it really is doing this, and it's very useful. It's called generalization. You can think of it as the statistical operation of clustering. It's taking anything within a little radius of similarity and labeling it, if you will, all with one name. That's the first feed-forward step in this circuit. Now it feeds down to this cell. It's also feeding over here, which we'll go to in a minute, but it's feeding down to this cell. And notice what it's doing. It's going to another inhibitory cell. So we've got a little cluster name, flower, and it feeds down here, and it literally inhibits, subtracts that cluster, that category name, from the input. All this takes a fraction of a second, and the flower is still there. You're still looking at it. So what happens? It goes right back up, and now different set of cells are going to respond because they're getting very different inputs. What are the inputs that they're getting? The inputs that they're getting now are this flower with the category flower subtracted from it. What is that? You could think of it as the remainder, the differences between lots and lots of different kinds of flowers. A daisy or a rose or a violet. So each of those differences now is now coming in because the category part of it, the flower part of it, has been masked away, and it comes in. Now this guy's going to respond again. So what we've got is an engine that first responds one way, it gives you a little name for something, and then it responds again a fraction of a second later with a completely different piece of information. So you're just statically looking at this flower, but your brain is going, flower, something else, and that something else is a subcategory. Saying flower with white petals that are thin, for instance, and a yellow center. And then that one gets sent down and subtracted, and it comes up again. And there's a set of physiological rules for, that is, the operating rules for these cells that determine how long you can cycle on this thing before you'll stop. But essentially what you're doing is you're building a little hierarchy. You can't help yourself. That engine just all by itself is building a little hierarchy. So first it says flower, then it says red flower, then it says rose. Or it says white flower, and then it says daisy. Notice what it's doing. It's reusing the same components over time, successive iterations, to get high precision computations. It's successively giving you more and more detail about the object that it's seeing simply by performing the same operation on a subset of the input. So it's one way of getting high precision computations from low precision components. We can write it as an algorithm now. We can simply say, oh, well, you've got an input. We're going to find the set of competitors that respond, and we're going to train their weights based on a little formula that will actually move those weights closer to the input that they've trained on, and then we're going to subtract all those responders from the input and do it all again. Having understood this thing, we can now apply it to anything we want. So let's take a little brief auditory input now, not really time varying, just very brief. A, B, C. These are the cues we fed to it. In this case were a graduate student just talking into a microphone and giving these very brief utterances. A, B, C, D, like that. Notice what the first response of the system is. They're all alike. It's essentially saying, speech sound. That's what I hear. Speech sound. That's all I care about. But on the very next response, it's essentially moving the origin from way over there to right up to the center of the cluster, and it's now giving you different responses for AJK kinds of sounds versus EGC kinds of sounds, and if we do it again, you'll eventually get voiced CG kinds of sounds versus unvoiced EBD kinds of sounds. And again, you're building a little hierarchy, and you're traversing that hierarchy iteratively over time to say first sound, BDCG kind of sound, and eventually the letter itself. And again, high precision computations. Our first take-home message is that one way to generate high precision computation from low precision components is to reuse those components over time. These loops do this over and over again. It's one of their principles, if you will. Once we've reduced this thing to an algorithm, as we have, we can simply do what any good computer scientist will do, which is analyze it for its costs, its time costs and its space costs. What we find is it's performing a task. We can compare this algorithm to lots of algorithms out in the literature. It's doing a thing called hierarchical clustering, and hierarchical clustering is a very popular set of algorithms. It is it's something in which there's a lot of competitors, lots of different hierarchical clustering algorithms. This one turns out to compete extremely well, just this little brain algorithm competes extremely well with the best hierarchical clustering methods that are out there in the literature, which is very surprising. Essentially, it's linear in the amount of space that it needs to learn some given number of cues of a particular dimensionality. And it's better than linear in terms of the amount of time that it takes, the amount of time ticks that it takes when it's implemented in an appropriate parallel implementation, such as brain circuitry or actual silicon that we can construct. All that was this one here. Now we're going to go to the other half of the circuit, matrix loop, and we'll be much more brief. I'm going to get increasingly briefer as we go through successive circuits. So let's look at this matrix loop now. First thing to notice is it doesn't get any inputs of its own. So the inputs, remember, are coming in here, and its only inputs are fed back from, what was this thing up here? Category names. So category names going down, they were going over to here, and they also go over to here, and now they're being spread out. And you could think of the operation that's going on when they feed down to here and then spread way up to here. That operation can be thought of, can be modeled as a particular kind of hashing. That is, it's trying to give very different codes, very different responses to even very similar inputs. So it's almost doing the opposite of what the clustering mechanism was. Anything even slightly different that comes into it, it's going to spread it out and give it a different name. And then it's going to feed it in a loop as further inputs are coming into this guy. So let's look at what we can do. We can now look at time-varying inputs. So here's a speech stream. This thing I think is saying bluebird. And as we're hearing those sounds, we're literally like passing a little window over it, and we're going left to right. And the first step, we're generating this little feed-forward category in the core loop, just as we did before. And then that's being fed forward again to this matrix loop, and then the second input comes in. The second input, like that. And what's happening up here is now this thing is not just learning the first input, it's learning the combination or the coincidence of the second input with the feedback from the first one. So it's literally building a chain between part A and part B. And that chaining is, and those chains are extremely high capacity, and you can build an enormous number of them. Again, we can treat this as an algorithm. We can compute its capacity. We can do this both empirically and actually, it turns out, analytically. And what we find is that here, what we're plotting here is the number of sequences we can store with a certain tolerable error level that we just choose. So as long as we're under that error level, how many sequences can we store, given a particular size of a network? In this case, number of synapses. Could have been a lot of measures. So as the network gets bigger and bigger, how many sequences can we store? The number of sequences grows linearly. So we can make an arbitrarily large one of these, and we're not losing, we're not getting diminishing returns with scale. The same thing can be done with multiple other circuits, and so I'm going to simply mention the basal ganglia striatal complex, which in our hands and many hands does something like trial and error or reinforcement learning, punishment and reward learning. The hippocampus does something like compression and dilation of inputs that are squeezing and stretching inputs to try to align them. And the amygdala is doing something like filtering or toggling, almost readying certain brain areas to be selectively activated when you're in a certain, if you will, emotional state. So we can write down if you will, a little instruction set. Here's all the circuits of your brain, most of this, by the vast majority of circuits of your brain. Here's a little set of algorithms that are being carried out. Categories and hierarchical clustering, sequences and chaining, reinforcement learning, time dilation, and toggles. And that's all you got. That's the machine. And now we have to see, is it believable? We have to check ourselves and say, well, if that's what those circuits are all trying to do, what happens when you actually apply them to something? And so let's now take those circuits, put them in their big architecture, and see how they interact. The thing to remember is we had two parts of a single circuit, one of which did categorization, and the next one did sequences. And so here's what we get. We get little categories and sequences, and then we get sequences of categories of sequences as regions of the brain talk to each other. Then the outputs of one region of the brain become the inputs to a next region of the brain. And now you're embedding these things, you're nesting them. So you're getting arbitrarily deep sequences of categories of sequences of categories. And sequences of categories is actually, turns out to be a very well-known data structure. It is a grammar. So it's a grammar just like you learned in school. That is where you've got little rewrite rules, and you say a sentence is a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, for instance. So what do I mean by that? Well, a sentence is rewritten as a sequence, noun phrase followed by verb phrase. Each of those elements in the sequence is itself a category. So it's a sequence of categories. What are those categories? They are themselves sequences. So a noun phrase can be, for instance, an or a the, followed by an adjective, followed by a noun. So I keep embedding and re-embedding sequences by putting those sequences into categories. That's all a grammar is, sequences of categories of sequences of categories. And here we go. And we know a lot about those, and we know a lot about their costs. So now we've got our first clue that we've got a bunch of operations that give rise to a particular single concerted data structure, a set of grammars. What do we do with those? Well, we turn them loose on the world. So we present it with a bunch of, this is not meant to be ABC, it's meant to be just a bunch of arbitrary features. So it could be an eye or a nose or a mouth. We'll see those things. We'll see little relations between them as we move our eyes. We'll build those up, and we'll train on the ones that recur. Things that recur over and over again, we'll strengthen. Remember the strengthening that occurs at synapses. So the connections between two cells will become stronger if I see the same picture over and over again. Whereas, so this guy might become stronger, guy might be weakened and go away. And eventually I'm going to get, I can easily construct almost arbitrarily complex little grammars, little grammar recognizers in various downstream areas. So those areas become little specialists, if you will. They want to recognize their little sequence of categories of sequences of categories, and those specialists are nothing but learned grammatical relations among the features. That's what it's doing. It's taking these features, it's learning little grammatical relations. By grammatical I mean the sequences and the categories of sequences, and they're becoming specialists in those. Interesting thing. By learning, all we're doing is adding new grammar entries, new lines, new rewrite rules into that grammar. What we can get out of it is qualitatively new behaviors, right? All of a sudden I can recognize a face where I couldn't before. All of a sudden I can recognize a computer screen where I couldn't before, simply by training on it, by adding to this grammar. That's our second little computational take-home message, namely, as long as you're using grammars, it is quite possible to just make more of something, that conundrum that we asked about earlier, to just make more of something, quantitative change, and to get qualitatively different behaviors out of them. What does this look like in real brains? It turns out we can actually ask that question in some detail, and I'm going to just briefly gloss over this. But as you look at a picture, you look at a face or a cat or a house in this case, the first set of responders, the first set of cells that respond, are just responding to the individual features, just as in our little cartoon, individual features. Then the downstream cells are responding to combinations of those features. Further downstream, they're responding to combinations of combinations, and they eventually become little specialists, and you really do see little areas, distributed, to be sure, areas that specialize in faces and houses and animate objects. We can build, and there's a computer science student who's building these now, we can build little models of these and look at their behavior. So we can project an image onto a little early vision model. We can construct essentially the components of the components that a brain would actually be running on those inputs, on those pictures. We can think of that as literally a person, a subject, and we can give it a picture and watch what the model does. So what it'll do is, so we can construct this is what the cortical response, the initial V1 cortical response to that picture turns out to be, which is too bad. This is pretty, that's ugly. But interestingly, we can ask a question, which is, if this actually is a representation that's capturing information that was in the input, are we holding on to information? Can we reconstruct the image from that input? And it turns out that there's a bunch of experiments that have been done, and again, this is James Hughes' work, and he's replicated the work of a group called Kamatani and Tong, showing that we can actually reconstruct some of these. And interestingly, he can also reverse the process and just pretend there was an anti-brain, if you will, that could project the other way, so that once it goes into V1, he projects it back out and says, let's see what the picture would look like. The picture will look different depending on how many voxels, how many volume pixels we actually look at in a brain. If we use a big fat voxel size, big fat gross pixels, we'll get something that looks abstract. And as we increase the voxels, we'll get better and better reconstruction of at least the edges and outlines of the thing we're seeing. This is a starting point. It's a jump-off point. So we can now take that model as a starting point, build further downstream models, and give it lots and lots of inputs, as has been done in human experiments. Look at the voxel responses that the model gives and compare them with the voxel responses that humans actually exhibit, and look at the structure of, when we give it lots of houses, are they similar to each other? When we give it two animate objects, humans and cats, are they similar to each other, as they indeed are in our brains? Will they be in the model? That's a question that James and I and a number of other students are asking right now. So our third computational take-home message is, the models are, at the moment, exhibiting characteristics that are at least consistent with neuroimaging data. We hope to make them more than consistent. We hope to make them predictive, and there's a lot of work that's going on right now that is in progress on that. So that was learning. Now we're ready. We put all these things together, we have these components, and what we want to do now is say, that's a brain, that's a model for an entity. What can it do? Let's go right back to the task that we started with, which was the automated telephone operator. Let me see if I've got sound here. Yep, I do. So this is a spectrogram that says blue. Oh.
Blue.
And this is a spectrogram that says blue. And they're just two different utterances, blue and blue. And you can see that just that tiny difference makes, you can see a bunch of similarity between these things. It's got sort of the same little, whatever, striations here. It's got some of this stuff. But they're different, right? This one's stretched out more. This one has much more readily seen striations. This one has a stronger response up here. This one is weaker. Bunch of differences. What's the task? I'm sorry?
What's that image?
Oh, good, thank you. So what I'm looking at, great question. What I'm looking at is, this is a thing called a spectrogram, and all it is frequency on this axis, time on this axis. So I'm looking at what frequencies, and the colors are the power in each frequency domain. So I'm seeing that there was a lot of low frequency here, then there was suddenly a few frequencies, including some high frequencies, then it all went to low frequency, and then suddenly there was a little burst of multiple frequencies, and that was the sequence across time. And that was just about 100 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, okay? So the task that automated operator is trying to do is essentially to match this against that. It wants to know that whenever I say blue, whenever anyone says blue, that becomes a spectrogram-like input, and I can match it. I should be able to match it against a database of other spectrograms that I've already stored. Yes? That's the task that we discovered was apparently pretty darn hard, because it's one of the most expensive objects on the planet, and it can't do the task at least half of the time. It's interesting, you note that they're actually getting a little bit better every year. They're doing something incrementally, hammering away at the task. And yet people just get extremely good at this task very rapidly and stay good at it. Here's the question. If we apply these supposed brain circuit algorithms to inputs of this kind, what will they do with it? Will they match, for instance? No, they won't match. What they'll do is just what we described. They'll look for little categories of features. Here's a category, here's a category, here's a category. They'll look for sequences of those categories. So here's a sequence. Here's a sequence. And then they'll feed those downstream and they'll look for, so here's this down to this, and here's a sequence of sequences, or a category of sequences of categories. And then here's a sequence of sequences, and here's a sequence of sequences. And it's just by hearing a bunch of utterances of the word blue, it's capable of simply building, it's actually ignoring a lot of the detail in the spectrogram, and instead of paying attention to all the detail in the spectrogram, what it's looking for are the relations among features. It's like it's fishing for certain features, and when it finds those, it just wants to use them as landmarks. And then it says, okay, here's a landmark, it's in this relation to this other landmark, and that's all I'm going to store, that's all I'm going to remember about this speech sound. The intriguing thing about looking at these is that this thing you can match. Now you've got a skeleton of those sounds that is quite possibly will succumb to matches between blue and blue and blue and blue that will be a lot easier, both computationally less expensive and more likely to actually find a hit than trying to match all this enormous amount of detail, which is what they're doing. So right away it's suggesting something. It's saying, it's essentially saying two things. One, this is a very weird way to approach this problem. Why would you look at these when you know your task is to match them? Why in the world would you look at them and say, no, let's not match them. No, hold off. Let's instead find little features. Let's find relations between features. Let's build a hierarchical structure for this. That's somehow what these brain circuits say they want to do. And interestingly enough, we find that as a purely pragmatic engineering approach, maybe it's really, really a good idea. Maybe it's a flanking action, a non-standard engineering approach that might give us a better solution. And indeed, there's actually some companies that are looking at this kind of approach right now to see if they can compete head-on with even the very carefully handcrafted hidden Markov model implementations that are currently being used by the phone companies. Again, all it's doing is just what the thing was doing before, learned grammatical relations among components. So our take-home message for this is there are non-standard engineering approaches. It's not that they're mysterious. We can understand them very well. They're doing categories, they're doing sequences, they're doing relations, they're building hierarchies. They're learning those hierarchies. We can understand each step. It's just that they're not the steps we would have chosen. In fact, they're not the steps that engineers through the ages have ever chosen when they approach this task, because the task looks like a matching task. But these circuits say, no, I've got a non-standard approach to that. And non-standard engineering is going to be a theme. Same brain circuits. The same brain circuits are at play when we look at a picture as when we listen to sounds. So now we've got to ask the same question. We can look at these things called captures, which are little, squirrely looking letters that everybody's seen on the internet. You have to type them in to, why do you type them in? Oh yeah, to prove that you're not an algorithm, right? You're doing it to prove that you're human. Everybody's seen these things? So you have to, access to certain websites is gated by, you have to look at this thing and simply type in MULONOL. Interestingly enough, the reason that they do this is because the computer vision people have failed to write algorithms that can take a look at that and see what the letters are. That's the only reason they're using these. Purely pragmatic. Uh-oh. It's a comeuppance. We're talking about computer vision, big, huge, extremely well-funded field, many of whom are probably here, and I'm deeply insulting them now. Sorry. But I've been in this field myself. It's a real comeuppance. It's saying that whatever approaches we've been using to do handwriting recognition, to do character recognition, is not general. It doesn't extend to these kinds of inputs. Now, by the way, there's a furious activity out there in computer science, carefully tailoring more new vision algorithms so that they can do some of these things. They're getting better and better at them every year, which is why these things are getting more and more squirmy every year, so that they can outwit them. But the important thing is not that they can get better and better at it, but that they have to hand tool it every time. Whereas there must be some approach that we're using, which is simply looking at these things and seeing, oh yeah, they're squirrely, but they're letters. again, we asked the question, what would those brain algorithms do if you simply put these things in as inputs? Now, this is work by Andrew Felch, where first what he did was a front end of, there are some specialized mechanisms way out the periphery. Remember those little colored areas of the first few visual areas, the first few auditory areas that do different specialized things. And then it just starts to find little features. So I've color-coded them here. So we've got a feature here and a feature there and a little relation between them. A feature here, a feature there, a little relation. I think I've got a close-up. There we go. Right, certain little relations between, so little sequences of categories and little building up sequences of, here we go. So now we've got sequences of sequences, sequences of sequences of sequences. We can build these up and use those landmarks. That's all it's doing. Instead of trying to match this squirrely thing against some stored version of an A, instead it's extracting these little landmarks and saying, I want these landmarks, I want them to be in this relationship to each other. Let's see if those match something in my database. And indeed they do, and this thing is quite good at recognizing things as A's. How's it doing it? Again, exact same thing, learned grammatical relations among components. So, another take-home message, brain circuit methods that are applicable in one domain often are applicable across very different domains, all the way from, in this case, for instance, sound to vision. A more challenging task, this is from a database of so-called wiry objects, that is, objects that you can see through. So, these chairs, these Dartmouth chairs down here are wiry. You can see the background, you can see the floor, you can see the wall. Every time I turn the chair, the bar stool, it's going to give me a different view. But what do the brain algorithms do when they see it? So these are notoriously hard for vision algorithms. What the brain circuit algorithms do is they find little features, they find little relations between these features. This is, again, Andrew Felch's movie of a system learning a couple of layers, just 2 layers, of the features that it thinks occur in this bar stool. And having learned a bunch of them, it now searches a scene, a lot of which it can do in parallel. So it's searching for the bar stool over there. It's going to have a red box saying, nope. Another red box is going to appear. Nope. Now a green box is going to appear, and it's going to say, yep, I found the stool. And again, it's doing it. You can see how it's building up doing it. It's looking for little features, looking for relations between them. It can do this while things are moving. So here is a standard approach to just looking at individual features. And the colors, every single time it changes color, that's because it thinks a new feature is there, as though the whole car had been taken away and something else had been put there. It's a straw man, to be sure, but it just shows how hard it is to keep recognizing the same object as though it were stable when it's actually moving. The next movie is taking relations between features, and it's saying, even though that's moving up, I still see a little configuration of features, configuration of features, configuration of features. And so I can actually see the object as stable even while it's moving. We can build these up even larger. So I built a vision and an auditory system. Now let's build them up into a motor system. This is a little learning artificial bot. We have a real one in a minute. It's trying to learn to stand, not doing a very good job. This one is going to learn to stand, or it's already learned, and now it's just exhibiting its learning. And now let's take those and let's talk about 2 kinds of things. We've now got engines that can do useful perceptual tasks, can do useful motor tasks. We're about to put those together into robots. On the way to putting them together into robots, let's look at how we can take advantage of the fact that they came from circuits, they came from brain circuits. We should be able to implement them back into hardware. And indeed, they have these same very happy characteristics of brain circuits, namely, extremely brain-dead, simple learning rule. Very low precision connects. Now all these things that were embarrassing before are extremely attractive, because now we know that we can build algorithms that are useful out of these. And now we want to build those algorithms out of crappy components because it's cheaper to do that. Yes? Wouldn't it be nice if we could build algorithms of this kind and use inexpensive, cheap, low precision, crappy components to do so? Yeah, I could make money on that. So, low precision connects, very sparse connectivity, modular components repeated over and over again. So, simple learning rule that just increments and increments. Very low precision connects, so all we need is like, in this case, a little floating gate. We can build those in very sparsely to just a set of crossbar interconnects. There's a bunch of labs that are now doing this kind of thing. It's very modular, so we can build these over and over again into different parts of, in this case, superior, middle, and deep layers of cortex, some of that same cell or circuit loop model that I was showing you before. And we can then build those into large-scale integrated circuits, and what we've done is, so there's a lot of work that's going on taking those characteristics and trying to build special purpose hardware that can carry out those intrinsically parallel algorithms. In the meantime, what we've done is take parallel machines like the IBM Cell machine, which is also the Sony PlayStation 3. Can't imagine why it's far better known as the Sony PlayStation 3, but it is. And we can use the fact that there are a bunch of separate CPUs in that and try to spread some of the operations across those parallel machines. And we can also do this with FPGAs, and a group of us, a collaborative group here at Dartmouth and in Irvine, built some of these, and what they found was they got a speed up of 2 orders of magnitude immediately, just embedding one of these vision algorithms. In fact, exactly that vision algorithm that I showed you that looks for bar stools. I wanted to find the bar stools. It was a personal choice. It sped that up 100 times. And furthermore, in terms of power usage, it got something on the order of a 2,500 times improvement per watt that was used. The reason, yes, please.
Is the cell slower or faster than doing it with your own gate array?
Oh, good question.
Is it intrinsically parallel, and the gate array does things in parallel much more than you could do with even a 4-core machine?
Yeah, the FPGA is better to do this with if you can do it. It's not the fastest piece of hardware in the world, but it's got a lot more. You can put together a lot more processing elements. So the more processing elements we have, the better off we are, because the algorithms themselves they're not serial trying to be parallelized. They're just intrinsically parallel, right? So I should call out the fact people have been trying to build parallel machines for a long time. You probably, many of you have quad-core machines, right? We've all heard the little phrase, quad-core machines. If you don't have one, you wish you did, right? But quad-core machine is a machine that has 4 CPUs in it instead of the one that machines used to have a couple of years ago. Here's a question for you. How comes it isn't 4 times faster? Right, seems like ridiculous. Oh, Granger, why are you asking such a silly question? But it's not a silly question. Turns out that there are ways that you could program such a thing that it really would be 4 times faster. It's got 4 CPUs in it in place of 1. Why isn't it 4 times faster? It's because the software you're running on it is intrinsically serial. And it's really, really hard, intractably hard, to take intrinsically serial steps in an algorithm. That is, steps where one step depends on the output of the step before it. So they are inherently serial. And try and spread those out among a bunch of processors. You simply can't do it because this guy is just sitting there waiting for the output of the one before it. So most of these parallel machines cannot take advantage easily of serial programs. They can't, serial programs can't take advantage of parallel hardware, because we don't know how to spread them across parallel machines. And it's not for lack of trying. Again, it's another one of these things where lots and lots of people are working on this. But when you have an intrinsically parallel algorithm, that is one that started off without these serial dependencies between steps, then you can very readily spread it across parallel machines, and we can really demonstrate the power of that. So it's the intrinsic parallelism that enables these great gains. Just as a side note, and just to toot the horn of the students who did this work, there was an international competition for programming the cell clusters just last year in 2007, and there were 80,000 entries to the competition. That's a lot of hackers out there. 80,000 entries. And these guys, Andrew Felch and his group, came in first place. Go, Andrew. Intrinsically parallel algorithms can directly take advantage of direct hardware implementations. And that's an extremely strong statement because most algorithms cannot do so. Let's now go the last step up to robots. So some of the work in our lab has been to try to build an appropriate platform for taking these brain algorithms and being able to make use of them. What we want is something that is reconfigurable, where it can have lots of different configurations, just as we do as we're growing up, and are very sensor-rich. That is, you've got lots and lots of sensors, so it's got inputs to learn from. Most robots, you don't realize this, there's these fabulous robots that you can buy out there, and they'll dance, and they'll do a head flip, and they'll do all sorts of things, but they have no sensors. They're not listening to the world at all. They're doing pre-programmed little moves, very careful motor moves that aren't in any way connected to sensors that are coming in from the world. These things that these guys are building are very sensor-rich. They're full of sensors. They're reconfigurable. So here's one with legs. Here's one with a track. And we're trying to put them into situations where we can now see how well they can learn complex sequences of both inputs, just perceptual inputs, and complex interaction between perception and motor behavior. Here's an example, a very, very simple, dumbed-down example. If I show it a 2, like that, it can learn to recognize that 2. We saw that it could just do that. It learned to recognize an A few minutes ago. It can learn to recognize a 2 just the same way. Having recognized a 2, can it draw a 2? It's an interesting question. You would think, well, sure, if it can recognize it, then it knows what a 2 is, and therefore it can draw it. But what actually happens is something like this in this cartoon. Even after it's seen lots and lots of 2s, and it knows the variability that occurs in things that are the number 2, nonetheless, the representation that it builds only has those few landmarks, remember? It's ignoring much of the input, so it's looking at those landmarks, seeing relations among those landmarks, and that's all it knows. When it tries to draw one, not so much. The reason is a very good reason, or a very real reason. Namely, the thing that it's using, that it's taking advantage of to learn the 2, is hurting it when it tries to produce one. Interestingly enough, what we're trying to get it to do is to look at, so it just produced this. Now it can also look at what it just produced, right? It's right out there, it can look at it, and it already knows what it was trying to produce. It knows, I was writing a 2. These are the 2s. This is what I just wrote. Mismatch. And it can use that mismatch to train itself without any extrinsic input so that it can say, well, here's where I thought these features were, here's where they are in the input, and incrementally it can try to get better and better at producing the outputs. A couple of take-home messages. Recognition representations, that is, representations that work to recognize things, are not sufficient to produce those same things. You have to actually add quite a bit of richness into the representation in order to actually produce things. And another way of saying that is that for some tasks, for many tasks actually, in order to learn those tasks, you actually have to interleave some perception, some motor, some perception, some motor, and you have to go back and forth. So here's the robot now having acquired the ability to move its head to track an object that it's been told that it likes, an object that it likes, this little red ball. Oh dear. Here's this is just a mock-up of the robot being trained, but not yet learning, but at least we're trying to teach it to make difficult movements that require it to pay attention, to see what it's doing, and then to coordinate its motor moves with that. The same thing can be done in this example. Holy. So it's trying to say bad kitty, and it's not very good at it. It's going to get a little bit better. Oops. A little bit better, and it keeps getting better as we train it. So, take-home message, learning can require not just a bunch of perception, not just hearing things, not just seeing things, but interleaved perception and action. Now, let's take it, let's assume that we've got these engines, we've got them, they're doing perceptual behavior, they're doing motor behavior, and we can interleave perception and action. Let's say now that we give it high-level cognitive kinds of inputs, like John hit Sam. What's cognitive about that? Well, it's English words. At some point, you're encoding the little features and curves in the J and the O and the H and the N to say, oh, that's a word, John. Oh, I know what that is. That's an animate male object that has the name John, and Sam is this, and hit is an event. Using the exact same mechanisms, exactly the same mechanisms, it can build these hierarchical grammars, the exact same little phrase, learned grammatical relations among the components of the input. But now it's doing it with linguistic elements instead of with perceptual elements. And indeed, this is where we're more familiar with them. This makes sense, because we know about learning grammars from linguistic elements. What's interesting about it is it's the same mechanism as we're using for perception. So it's not that, it's another one of those conundrums we had early on. How is it that we don't, that humans have this ability for language, and yet they have the same brains just scaled up as other primates do, and in fact as dogs and rats do? Possibly it's simply by building deep enough hierarchies to get to the point where these become cogent inputs, and if you keep building them, you build up linguistic hierarchies just as naturally as you build lower level perceptual hierarchies. And that's a hypothesis that we're currently actively pursuing in the lab. So it's possible that linguistic grammars can be constructed by the same mechanism as perceptual grammars. So I'm going to start to summarize. We started with very low-level cortical and subcortical circuits. We built those up into a little instruction set of elements, of algorithm elements, hashes, clustering, sequence chaining, reinforcement learning, time dilation. We built those into little nested sequences of things, sensory motor grammars, and we showed that those could be learned, that those could be used for learning, learning by example, by input, learning by production, learning by interleaving the two. We're now currently trying to drive that upwards, as in that linguistic example, to say, well, wait a minute, can we get symbols? Can we get it to store abstract concepts? Can we get it to do some kind of abstract reasoning? And indeed, can we get it to do language-derived behaviors and reasoning? And the hypothesis we're going after is the last take-home message, which is brain instruction sets may be able to build arbitrarily high-order behaviors just via composition, by composing those individual elements. So I took you through circuits, algorithms, architectures, and learning, and then some example abilities. And I gave you a bunch of take-home messages. High precision computation, quantitative changes that give rise, right in front of us, quantitative changes that give rise to qualitative changes because they're grammars, models that are predictive of some current neuroimaging data, a whole host of non-standard engineering approaches, that is, very easily understandable approaches, but weird flanking actions, left field kinds of approaches that you wouldn't ordinarily think of given the task, like matching. We show that these are replicable across multiple domains, that they lend themselves to direct hardware implementation, that learning may require an embodied robot, that is, something that's actually able to act on the world so that it can act, see what it's acted, act again, before it can learn, and that we may be able to use this to build all the way up to language and arbitrary high-order behaviors. There's a lot more information at our website, and if you have thoughts about this or further questions, we'd be glad to field them, and I'd be glad to field questions now. Thank you very much.
That was a fascinating talk. Do we have time for a question or two?
Yep.
So early on, you presented these circuits.
Mm-hmm.
You had this X, and you had one loop and a second loop.
Good.
I assume there's there's billions of repetitions. So each of those wires represents billions of connections. So,
Yes. Right.
But it wasn't clear how you know that writing that down. You even wrote some code that simulates what you think is going on.
Right.
Why that can handle this hierarchical composition of sequences and categories. Right? That it's not obvious because people have been people have been doing neural networks for a long time, and
Oh, good question.
Why
Right.
write down a mathematical formula for how some inputs are going to affect other outputs?
Right.
Why it should be that has the capability of doing this hierarchical.
Great. So the first thing to point out is that these are emphatically not neural networks. They should be, and we should be able to use that term neural networks because they're networks of neurons, but the term neural networks got misappropriated early on to refer to a tiny little suite of algorithms. And those are the only ones that anybody ever refers to as neural networks. And you're quite right, they're extremely limited. It's worth pointing out that they're also like very valuable and they apply in lots of domains, and people have made a lot of money off them too. But they only do certain things. Among other things, they do not build grammars. They do not build sequences. They do not build relations. It's not the case that they have hierarchically organized architectures. So in this case, the output of one area is the input to another area. And that typically doesn't happen with normal neural nets. It does in a trivial way. If you have, again, it's because all it's doing is very simple algorithms. It's not building data structures of this kind. If you build data structures of this kind and provide the outputs of one area to the input as input to another area, you very readily actually get these data structures nesting. It's not mysterious. So it's really just, the only reason it happens is because these are different algorithms, and those algorithms are, again, not mysterious. They can be easily written down, and when you wire them up in this upstream, downstream, further downstream fashion, then these things just fall out. The hierarchies just fall out. There's code of this kind that's out there available to anyone who wants to play with it, run it.
So is there any limit to the number of levels?
It's a great question.
You know, is it like limited by the number of the parallelism you have or something?
It's limited by the parallelism, by the number of elements that you've got in there. It's also limited by the depth that you can go to. Possibly until you can go to a certain depth, no one knows how deep that is, until you can go to a certain depth, maybe you can never make it build language, for instance. Maybe. What if you had bigger brains than humans? Maybe they'd learn things that are more complex than language. We don't know what the limits on these things are. We're inferring from the constraints that we see in biology, but we simply don't know how to quantify those, where those stop. And I think that's a great question. We really would like to know the answer to that. Yes?
So if you forget something, is the process of forgetting can give you room to put in, say, like more level hierarchy?
Great question, great question. So, right, you're asking in part a capacity question, which is how many of these things can you store? One of the things that neural nets, for instance, do is they constantly erase things that they learned before as they're building new things. So a lot of training has to re-look at the same objects that it saw before over and over again. These things, by and large, and actually there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that most biological synapses may actually not erase. Now that's just wrong. That can't be right. Why can't it be right? Because you'll run out of them. Right? If you just keep adding new synapses and keep incrementing weights, eventually you'll hit some ceiling and all the synapses will be used up and you won't know anything anymore. So surely that notion that we only increment synapses has to be wrong, except for one thing. Let's calculate the number of things that you actually learn. Turns out you can easily do that. Let's say you learn, we were just doing this earlier today, let's say that you learn one new thing, pick your interval, every second, every 10 seconds. One new thing every 10 seconds for, say, 10 hours a day, for 24 hours, 10 hours a day for some, pick your number. These will only change by, like, maybe an order of magnitude, nothing more. 10 hours a day, 365 days a year, 100 years. Let's use that one. One every 10 seconds, 10 hours a day, every day for 100 years. Huh?
That's the 8, right?
Yeah, so it's about 50 million items. That's a tiny little number. How many synapses you got? By some estimates, 100 trillion. With a T. It's perfectly possible that you are using up these things and that if you kept learning for a few thousand years, you'd eventually run out. It's possible. We don't know whether biology is kludgy enough to operate that way, but there's plenty of reason to think it might be. So part of your answer part of your question was about capacity, and that's a way of addressing capacity is to say, well, maybe it's doing something much simpler than you think because maybe it's not worried about running out of capacity. Maybe it has unbelievable excess capacity. Does that help address it? Yeah. Yes.
The final representation, for example, for an A, unique.
Good question. Right. So by and large, no. Another student, Andrew's working with him, but Ashok Chandrasekhar, who's building one of these vision systems, is finding that if he looks at the same object in a bunch of different ways, in a bunch of different settings, sometimes he'll end up building a separate representation, for instance, for the same object. And there's no problem with that. It doesn't care as long as it can recognize that the object is there and it can connect those up somewhere downstream. It doesn't have to try to shoehorn all those into one single representation. And to go the other way, which was really your question, it doesn't have to say so here's what will happen. When it first learns an A and a D, they'll be the same thing. And it won't know that a D is not an A until you tell it that a D is not an A. And you say, see, the longer thing on the end of the D, that means it's not an A anymore, right? Visual aid, A, D. You have to tell it. Otherwise, those might have been, there might be some written language in which those are the same letter, and you don't care about the length of that thing, right? But it turns out in our language, in our alphabet, those are different. And so we have to actually tell it that. And so it first has to, it will make errors, and then based on the information, it'll actively look for features that differ between the two, and then it'll find separators for them. So it'll go through phases where things are non-unique, and then if it has to, it tries to make them unique. Does that help?
So yeah, so if it knows what an A looks like, and it wants to sort of randomly try to figure out how to draw an A, could it come up with something that's totally different than an A and say, yep, I got it?
It could, and initially, again, it does. Someone has to say to it that that's not an A. And one of the things that happens is we don't realize we're doing it, but we never get examples, lots of examples of not quite A's, right? That doesn't occur in the natural world until we create them, right? When we try to write an A as little kids, we create a whole bunch of near-miss A's. And it's only because we got a teacher that says, nah, not so much. That's when you recognize that you have to add constraints to what was a perfectly good, what you thought was a perfectly good representation. Yeah. Yes.
It's the importance of using embodied agents.
Right.
That they're dealing with, and that's an environmental response. Someone telling you it's the wrong way.
That's exactly right. So not only are you getting that response, but you might have to actually produce some of those. And so a lot of what we keep finding is that a lot of learning won't proceed in anything that we'll recognize as a normal way unless you can actually interact with the world, which is weird because you would think, it's one of these philosophy questions. If a little baby grew up behind a glass partition and got to watch the world but never got to act on it, would it grow up to be a Dartmouth student? And that came out wrong, didn't it? But what I mean is, can you learn all that you need to learn about the world just by observing without actually acting on it? There's a lot of reason to think, no, you cannot. And the answer to that question is still unknown. It's still an empirical question. We don't have any theoretical way to approach it. But it's a troublesome empirical question, because if we have to do that interaction with the world to learn, we're going to have to build these embodied agents. Yes?
Have you ever done any thinking about some of these amazing people that can tell you what day of the week it is?
Great question, yeah. We wrote about some of those recently in this. The simple answer is we certainly have thought about these things, but most of the work that we're doing is way below the level of even individual differences. We don't have theories of, and theories barely exist anywhere in the field, of what it is that's different between this particular Dartmouth student and that particular Dartmouth student. If there are two people who are very much alike and have similar abilities and they're different, what are the differences between them? What causes those differences? There's some nature, there's some nurture, there's some interaction between the two, there's some developmental period, critical period things. So we're not remotely yet at the level where we can talk about individual differences. We would be happy to build just one entity and have it be the human for now, and have all of them be alike, and we wouldn't know how to give rise to individual differences yet. And that's a concern. It's something that we're very interested in studying. actually a lot of the field of psychology is also interested in studying it, and neuroscience is interested in studying it. The data on it are still beyond our reach.
My question was actually, looking at these amazing people,
Yep.
can you learn something about how the brain is constructed?
So, thank you. So yes, and we actually recently did some work on this. You get constraints from this. How is it possible, for instance, that you break something, you think of it grossly, coarsely, you break something in the brain, and what you get is somebody who becomes, an automatic concert pianist, right? Wait a minute, it's broken and now it's working better than the norm? Surely that's wrong. Or you break something in the brain and now you have somebody who can, count all the toothpicks that his brother just dropped on the floor. Anybody seen Rain Man? Right. What is that? That's a brain that's like supposedly malfunctioning, right? Non-PC thing to say, but you could say it, and you're getting it wrong if you think it's malfunctioning, because it's doing something that the so-called supposed normal brain is not doing. It's a great set of constraints, because what it's suggesting is there are hidden mechanisms under there that are just waiting to be unveiled that we're clamping down on. We don't want to be able to have that ability because it's giving us some additional ability that is of some other value to us. And precious little work has been done on that, but that's the kind of constraint that we hope to mine out of examples like that. There's a lot of work on that kind being done, but not much to show for it yet. Yeah, yes?
It seems like one of the things that emerges when you give an overview like this is that for a long time we tried to push towards solutions to some of these problems with the serial algorithms that make sense to us, and ramping up the horsepower that we apply to them.
Right.
And then there's this realization that, well, maybe the algorithms that are actually used in practice work differently. Maybe we apply some parallel techniques. Presumably, at least some of the work from here on out is ramping up the parallel horsepower given to the execution of those algorithms to see where we get.
Yep.
Is it clear at all what the next problem is going to be yet?
It's a great question. So a lot of people are working on, still the problem of how to parallelize intrinsically serial algorithms, but it's starting to be widely thought that maybe there's not going to be any traction in that. So what other people are looking at are families of intrinsically parallel algorithms and trying to understand how, very much something that has very much the flavor of the kind of thing we were talking about today. Are there families of intrinsically parallel algorithms that we might find have compositional relations, that we can compose to build new kinds of algorithms that we're not used to, maybe actually groping towards a new non-standard engineering vocabulary that will enable us to embed these things in parallel. There are some big efforts going on right now to build suites of parallel algorithms of that kind, and machines, hardware machines that go with each one of them. There's a bunch of these. There's a bunch of companies that are feeding into this, and there's a bunch of academic units that are collaborating with those companies to try and build these. So specific tasks, I don't even think I'd venture a guess, but some of the kinds of things we're looking at now, because we keep butting right up against them, things like sensors. If you've got lots and lots of parallel sensors and you want to integrate those sensors, you spread a bunch of things out across a city, for instance, and you want to see, is there a traffic jam? You could do all that very, very rapidly and efficiently in parallel if you knew what algorithms to build, and there are people working on tasks like that. So there are urban engineering tasks, there are sensor tasks, there are a bunch of military tasks, there are a lot of psychological and neuroscience kinds of tasks like perception and action. That would be a reasonable first shot. And that's a good place to leave it.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much. A fascinating topic.